Welcome to the I5 podcast. I'm very chirpy today. We're covering the interview. I'm here with my co-host Jim,
Hello.
and I am Jonathan. Well, that certainly it certainly made a lot of shockwaves like that interview. But we'll get right into it. I do think we need to cover the disclaimer. I'm just going to put my opinion out here. I have mixed feelings about Tucker Carlson. Just to basically be objective in relation to this, while we think Tucker Carlson has done some damn good journalism, it does need to be said that he has admitted to lying in the past, such as lying about the Iraq War, and also in relation to the recent Fox News lawsuit that happened a year or two ago. He did admit to lying about voting machines in the U.S. election, so he has had his fair share of disgraces. We are covering the Trump interview today, but I just thought I would put that out there, Jim, that we are aware that he doesn't have a perfect history of always telling the truth, but to be honest, which journalist has?
Yeah.
So with
Especially in
that,
this day and age, journalism is more like propaganda, but there are a
yeah,
few exceptions. But yeah,
oh, definitely. But this interview that Trump has done, sorry, this interview that Tucker Carlson has done with Putin, it's certainly made a lot of shockwaves. It's actually historic because what we've gotten is an interview with Putin seeing the other perspective of the war that's currently going on. And it's like I said, it's made some ripples. Joe Biden, NATO have condemned it. The German Chancellor laughed at it, saying that it shouldn't have happened. At one point in the months before this, the media were denying that it happened. They were making fun of Tucker Carlson, saying there's no way he's done it. Then they started calling him a Russian sympathizer. They started calling him a traitor at one point. I know The Guardian certainly said it wasn't legitimate journalism. But just to finish on this, just to get our opinion out there, I actually think this was a very well done interview. And I think one of the reasons why people don't know how to process it is because they've not seen real journalism in a while. But this is what objective journalism should be with this interview. What do you
I
think?
mean, I agree, but the objectivity nowadays is something completely different. Objectivity, everyone is always on about objectivity as long as it fits the narrative. If something
Yeah.
doesn't fit the narrative, then all that goes out of the window.
Mm,
And it's sad to see that this is how they want us to think because you have the Putin interview, but I don't see Zelensky one.
that's true. And Tucker Carlson did actually offer to interview Zelensky. I
I
imagine
mean, there
Zelensky wouldn't do it, but
yeah, there has been Zelensky interviews. Don't get me wrong. I mean, the guy went on tour for quite a while,
they're very
pleading every
softball.
single one of us for money and trying to put the fear of God, or rather the fear of Putin,
Mm,
into us, because if they fall, we're next, and we should be glad to offer our
mm,
blood, sons, daughters, anything, everything to Ukraine in order to make sure they stop there.
mm.
But yeah, the little I didn't look into details the previous interviews with Zelensky, but these little bits and clips I've seen here and there,
Mm.
I wouldn't say they were objective.
That's true.
It
And the
felt
thing,
more like these ads you see before the movies, or no, actually the mobile the ads for mobile games that are
mm,
like, oh, do this and this is cool and that, and apply now and you get this, but it kind of gave the same vibe
mm,
in a sense here and there, but it was more about instilling fear that
mm.
if we fall, you're next, so you better pay us up and
Yeah.
help us.
And in stark contrast in the Putin interview. Now, I'm not saying you can necessarily take Putin at his word, but we have a counter presentation there in which Putin is saying that he's not interested in moving into Western Europe at all.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's in Ukraine's best interest to say, it's going to be Western Europe that falls. I personally don't think Russia would go into Western Europe anyway, because it would be begging for World War III. I think it's a regional
yeah.
dispute. But
People
with
might give a lot of shit to Putin in general, but you've got to admit that out of the most recent interviews we've seen in general globally
Mm,
that involved prime ministers, he's the only one that can actually speak properly
that's
and being
actually,
cohesive and
yeah.
articulate in Russian, of course,
Mm,
but still compare that interview to recent interview of Biden or Rishi
yeah.
Sunak or even Boris Johnson,
Yeah.
or any of the, whatever.
That was a point I was going to make later. You can see the contrast between Joe Biden and Putin in the sense of Joe Biden just doesn't seem with it mentally. Like there is something cognitively wrong with him.
Yeah.
Maybe it's dementia, maybe he's just being too old. I don't know, but he's not cognitively fit to be in command of anything anymore. That's just my personal opinion. And I don't think, because people made these accusations about Putin at one point, but I don't think they want the populations to see just how coherent Putin is. Bearing in mind, there's a difference between what someone says and whether they're coherent or not in terms of subject matter. I'm fully aware Putin will tell lies as well. I'm not saying he won't, but he doesn't come across as someone with mental problems. He doesn't come across as someone who's not cognitively able to function. He comes across, quite frankly, as a strong leader. I don't like the man, but he does come across
No.
as a strong leader.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though he is quite comedic with some of the things he does, hanging around with Steven Seagal and claiming that he wrestles bears and things. It is quite comedic. But
It is, yeah.
he has got his eccentricities, which make him a bit of a laughing stock, but not on Biden's level. You would never get Putin forgetting the name of Hamas and then referring to them as opposition instead of the enemy
Yep.
in a speech. But going into the interview, as you said, there's a narrative. And speaking of narratives, the first one that I would go into, I just wanted to talk about just to get it out of the way. Putin starts off a good chunk of that interview, because I think it's about 2 hours long or something. A good chunk of that interview is about 30 minutes to 40 minutes of Putin giving this very long-winded history lesson to Tucker Carlson, basically about how Russia has a historical right to Ukraine and how it's part of Russia. Now, I'm not saying that's entirely true. Putin has a way of telling these very long-winded stories, conflating facts, conflating events with fiction, and presenting it as a narrative and making it sound feasible when you can actually pick it apart, and historians have done that. I thought Tucker Carlson was quite ballsy with the way he kept on interrupting Putin, saying things like, sorry, what year is this? And Putin would always say, I don't remember. And then he would just continue on with the story.
Yeah. It certainly took a lot of balls to do the interview as well, considering Putin was on his, how do you
Oh
call
yeah,
it, area.
they're in the Kremlin.
So, yeah, it was ballsy. But at the
Mm,
same time, even though Clarkson tried to wind Putin up,
mm.
in some cases, Putin, you know,
Poker faced all the way through.
pretty much played the game, really. Well,
Yeah.
they both did.
Oh yeah, they were both calm all the way through. It was, Biden on the other hand is someone who loses his temper. I mean, I've seen Biden start fights with ordinary American citizens. The guy just has a temper and he loses it. One thing I was going to go into just on that historical narrative, while Putin's playing the historical narrative propaganda game, even before this he was writing essays, dissertations, journals to present this historical theory and this, quite frankly, historical fantasy, because it's a very complex period, and there might be some entitlement, but it's not absolute. It's very much up to debate. It's very much debatable. The West also did this as well, and I think this does need to be said to call out how the West tried to do this. There's a historian called Plokey, and I've read a few of his books. He's written The Gates of Europe, and he's written some works on Chernobyl and others. He's a good historian. He's very respectable. He recently wrote the Russo-Ukrainian War. That came out very early in the Ukraine war. I've read that twice, and Putin's not the only one that put forward propaganda. I was quite stunned that Plokhy actually wrote this, because while it's quite factual and it presents some very keen insights and some very keen interpretations into the Ukrainian war, it also omits a lot as well, and it's not impartial, mainly because Plokhy, the historian, is Ukrainian himself, and he was specifically chosen to write this book. Who you would call as the establishment, newspapers pretty much begged him to write this book. If you look at who endorses it on the UK side, it's entities like the Telegraph, people like David Lammy, an LBC radio host, Labour politician. So it's very much a book for the establishment to support their narrative. For example, in this book, he talks a lot about Russian war crimes in Ukraine. He may be right about that. He talks about Russia being the villain in this, and I would agree. We are not a pro-Russia channel in that sense. It is wrong what Russia are doing to Ukraine. It's just we don't feel it's a World War III scenario. And basically, he blames Russia for everything, but he gives no mention at all to NATO provocation or expansion. He doesn't even bring it up to dismiss it. He makes no amount of money of the he makes no mention of the sheer amount of money being made by Western arms companies who are exploiting Ukraine. He doesn't mention BlackRock, who have taken on a contract to rebuild Ukraine that Zelensky signed. I mean, obviously, I know that's going to be a hell of an investment in this video in itself, but I'm just saying he doesn't mention any of these things. He makes references to relationships between Prigozhin and Putin, a private military firm, being a sidekick to Putin or being the sidekicks to Putin or being a close ally, definitely, while completely ignoring the relationship between Prince, who owned Blackwater, and pretty much backed the Republicans under George Bush Jr. And Blackwater did a lot for the US military. In fact, it was part of the Rumsfeld doctrine to privatize the US military. He completely omits that kind of comparison. And it's almost as if it's doublethink, because everything he criticizes the Russians for in his book, the Americans and NATO have done the exact same things. And it's the exploitation involved as well. And I actually respect this guy as a historian. I've read a lot of his books, but I was very taken aback he would write this because he already has a bias being Ukrainian. That at the time of it being written, enough time hadn't passed to actually really give an accurate account of Ukraine, really. And like I said, a lot more's coming out, and it's just the sheer amount that is omitted. It's not even introduced and dismantled or debunked. It's just omitted entirely. So it's not just the Russians who have played the historical propaganda game here. Now I'm not gonna lie, we're probably gonna take a lot of flack on the channel for what I've just said there, because he's a really respected historian. So I just want to emphasize very much that I do respect this guy as a historian. He's a very credible one. He's a very accomplished one. It's just this particular book, I think it omits too much for it to be completely credible. The parts of the war it does cover are highly accurate. But I just wanted to make that clear. Putin went on this historical propaganda rant, but the West has also been pumping out a lot of propaganda as well about what's going on. He's not the only one at it. And I've just not seen that said by many other YouTube channels at all. So I thought I would just inject that in there. I don't know if you disagree with his doing that or not, or
No, I don't disagree.
I just felt it needed to be said.
Mm.
And that goes into what I was going to go into as well, which is we'll just get this out the way now. A lot of establishment journalists, like for example, The Guardian in the UK, they were very critical of this interview. I mean, there was a lot of rumors about this interview. It's not going to happen. I mean, even in our internal channel discussions, we were like, "Is this actually going to happen? Is this real?" Because there was a lot of it was almost of a mythical status. No one knew if it was going to happen or not, and then it just came out. Carlson started showing videos in Russia going into supermarkets. Funny story, how in the UK we have shopping trolleys, but we have like the little pound things that you put in. So when you have the cart in the shop, you have to put it back so you can get your pound out.
What?
Have you never used one of those?
No.
All right. So in the UK, shopping trolleys, if you want to use one and go in a supermarket, you have to put a pound into the shopping cart to unlock
Oh,
it.
oh yeah. Sorry, I got confused with something completely different. Yeah, yeah,
Fine.
yeah, yeah.
They have those in Russia, and there's a really funny video of Tucker Carlson saying this is amazing. It not only allows you to have a shopping cart, but it ensures that you bring it back. So evidently they don't have those in America. So him
No.
going to Russia is the first time he saw one of those. But
Yeah.
yeah, he's been called all kinds for this interview and actually investigating what life is like in Russia. The whole narrative that Russia's going bankrupt when parts of it clearly aren't. Parts of it are doing really well. He's been called all kinds for this interview: a Russian traitor, a traitor, an American traitor, a Russian sympathizer, pro-Putin. Western media don't like this interview.
Yeah, because it doesn't fit the narrative and it's
Mm.
as objective as it can be.
Mhm.
By saying objective, I mean that the interviewer, actually let the interviewee to speak properly without being interrupted all the time, which
Yeah,
is a common theme that we see on television
yeah,
news channels nowadays. That every single time when you have either a civilian or like another person of importance, quote unquote, like a politician, as soon as they try to say
yeah.
something that is a bit off, they immediately have to redirect the conversation, and you
That
had none of that on this interview, or rather, very little of that.
that's actually a very good point because like I said, I think the interview was 2 hours or something like that. There was no time limit. Putin kept on saying, "Do you want to continue, or is that it?" Now, obviously, that could have been staged, but you do get a feel for the fact that Putin, because Putin knew what a big event this was. This was him basically appealing to the Western audiences, because Tucker Carlson has a huge audience. You can tell Putin's taking this opportunity seriously. So
Oh yeah.
he's there for the long haul, whilst in UK, US media, obviously, as you say, TV times, there are restrictions, and a lot of politicians just wind down the clock. Putin's left himself in a position voluntarily where he doesn't need to do that. I mean, the guy blathered on for 40 minutes or something about history without answering the
Funnily enough, he
question.
said this would take like 30 seconds.
30 minutes.
That's what he said. Just give me 30 seconds to give you a short history lesson, and then he started rambling about 40 minutes.
Was it 30 seconds? Jesus, I thought it was 30 minutes.
No. He stated that it would be 30 seconds, and it ended up being 40 minutes or something. I mean, yeah.
Oh man. But like I said, that you could accuse him. The thing is, he must have wanted to say all of that, obviously, because he knew before the interview there was no time limit on it.
Mm.
And he didn't look like he wanted to rush off either. Like you would have Boris Johnson in his leadership election saying, "How long have we got left?" He wouldn't look like he was willing to talk forever. Now, I think Putin is very good at presenting what he's thinking about presenting the version of you that he wants you to see, and then there's the version of him that's going on inside his own mind. I think he's very good at doing that. I don't think he's a smart guy by any means. I don't think he's stupid. He's a typical thug from the KGB. He's had to survive his whole life. He's used violence and thuggery to get ahead. So you would have to be conniving and you would have to be sly to get ahead in that way. So I don't think he's a stupid man by any means.
No.
And what I think this was as well, from Carlson's point of view, a lot of mainstream media hacks are saying this is not journalism. I think the reason why it's so radically different to what we see on TV is because it is journalism. This is
Yep.
journalism as it should be. It's objective, very pointed questions that are to the heart of the matter.
Yep. And also, there is no hand holding in the sense that it's
Yeah.
up to you to filter the information. Like on this 40-minute history lesson, quote unquote, Carlson wasn't responsible in doing the search for you to see how much accurate the stuff Putin said was and all the kind of things.
I think with that as well, I agree with Carlson's little intro before the interview. I think Putin genuinely does believe his own narrative, whether he's made himself believe it or not. He is going to push that historical theory till the cows come home. But like I said, with Carlson, you've got all these pointed questions that go straight to the heart of the matter. Will you release this journalist? A lot of people said that was bad form. I'm not sure it is. Tucker Carlson sitting down with the man who can release that journalist. He asked him flat out, "Are you going to release this guy?" A lot of journalists wouldn't have had the stones to do that,
No.
especially sitting in the Kremlin. And I mean, we'll get into this later on as well. Putin's response was to just, without batting an eyelid, say, "I think there's been enough goodwill, or there's been enough gestures." But before we get into that, I was just going to say one more thing. There were no double-barrel questions. Now, what a double-barrel question is something along the lines of, I like to ask though, policy A is doing a lot of damage to the poor. Are you sure you're serious about the economy? So what the journalist can say is, "See, I did ask about policy A," but the politician can avoid the question on policy A altogether, because the last thing that was asked is, "Are you serious about the economy?" And then that gives them the opportunity to filibuster. Say, "Yeah, we are serious about the economy. We've done blah, 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 blah." So they basically evade the question altogether. Sophie Ridge is quite infamous for that, especially when it's politicians who she's on friendly terms with.
Yep.
So there were no double barrel questions that you normally see in UK media. It was a single question, very pointed, about a subject. I can't remember how he phrased it. What are your interests in Poland? Are you going to attack? I think he came out and just said it. Are you going to attack Poland? That's a very pointed question that gets to the heart of the matter. And it
That cannot
requires
be misinterpreted. And yeah, it's a yes or no question.
Yeah. And you don't normally see those with American or Western
sometimes you
journalists.
do, but even when you do, the politicians just repeat some bullshit, which is neither yes or no.
Oh yeah. and
And then
it's
you,
not
you ask
challenged.
them again, and they say the same thing, like a broken record,
Yeah.
pretending that they're idiots. God, I see that especially in debates, like pre-electoral
Yeah.
debates, and it pisses
Mhm.
me off.
Yeah. And you see it a lot as well, where there'll be a pointed question followed by an abstract question in a double barrel question format. So the politician can just miss out the pointed question altogether and answer the abstract one.
Yeah.
And Carlson, as well, in this interview, he has the balance of knowing when to challenge. He lets Putin make the point fully. I mean, he does interrupt mid sentence during the history lesson, but he allowed Putin to talk for what, like 18 minutes before he said, "Sorry, what's this got to do with anything?" Because it did look like it was going nowhere. And he also knew when to ask for details. You know, what year was this? What date was this? Now that's good journalism because in his own way, he's challenging Putin's historical narrative, asking when was this, where was this, you know, to tie down the fallacies and the lies to a date and a place. And at times, Putin just wouldn't do it. He would just say, "I can't remember."
Mm.
So
Yeah.
I think that was very well challenged. I mean, I do think you're entitled to there. I think it's acceptable to interrupt someone in the following circumstances. If someone is just attacking their opponent with accusations without any criticism of the argument, that's when you can interrupt. Or if someone is just talking and talking and talking to the point where they're trying to overload their opponent by having so many things in that their opponent can't possibly respond to all of them, you do have to interrupt them at that point and just say, "Look, I'm gonna have to cut you off there. You can do your other stuff, but let the opponent respond to the first 18 things you've said, and then you can say the remaining 9."
Yep.
There are probably other circumstances as well that aren't coming to mind, but those seem to be the guidelines that Carlson was following, along with, if details are omitted, challenge for the details, which again is good journalism.
Yep.
And the mainstream media, you know, were very threatened by this because a lot of what Putin said went against their narrative.
Yeah,
It's gonna,
exactly. The narrative is all about Ukraine now, and anything that
Mhm.
might threaten that narrative should be immediately banned. At least that's how they think. And
Yep.
this doesn't have to do whether Putin is right or wrong. This has to do with what they're trying to push.
Whilst in the West, we had the historian Sergei Ploki basically write a book which completely misses out NATO provocation, the military industrial complex, war economies, you know, other thing like that, the complex history between Russia and Ukraine, simply Russia bad, Ukraine good, and how the whole world should be concerned about this. And
Yeah.
Putin's perspective basically blows holes in that. I mean, I've been saying on this channel for a long time, I don't think Putin is stupid enough to start World War III. I don't think he wants World War III.
No.
And that showed in this interview. But what I would say is, don't believe everything Putin says just because he said it to Tucker Carlson. Do your
Well,
research.
yeah,
Because
because at the end of the day, he is a
yeah,
politician.
true. And that's not at you, by the way, Jim. That's just for our audience, in case they misinterpret us as saying Putin's right because he said this. No, I don't. I take a ton of salt. Listen to Putin. When I say what I think is true, it's not because Putin said it. It's because of my own research, if that makes sense.
Yep.
I'm just not surprised he's saying it out loud. But one thing that the history war between Putin and the Ukrainians does demonstrate is that there is a complex geopolitical and regional dispute in Eastern Europe. It's extremely complicated. There's a long history behind it, and I think from this, the last thing it needs is NATO micromanagement.
Yeah. And I think that's the main reason of conflict,
Mm,
personally.
yeah. Well,
This is where it boils down to.
yep. Yep. So basically, as well, like I said, Putin's gone for, at this point in the interview, Putin's gone for the regional issue narrative rather than using this as an opportunity to say turn against your leaders. You know, he's going for, this is a complex regional history where Russia is entitled to Ukraine. As I said before as well, he also basically mentions key events and then embalms them with his own subjective interpretations to create the narrative Ukraine or some of its land is actually Russia. History is basically one of his prongs of propaganda. I'm actually looking at my notes as well, where to go next, and I put like timestamps on my notes, and it's like 37 minutes. That's how long he spoke about the history, 30 seconds to 37 minutes.
I mean, yeah, but at the same time, name another politician of today that who's able to recite and talk about history for 37 minutes.
Yeah,
I cannot imagine Rishi Sunak knowing anything in regards to British history.
and Joe Biden can't even. I think
Joe
aside
Biden
from,
cannot even talk straight for 37 seconds.
I mean, there were times when he couldn't read. There were times when he couldn't even read a teleprompter correctly. I'm sure
Or
there's
he
footage
was
of him.
reading the full of the teleprompter, correct? Like even the quotes
Yeah,
and parentheses that he wasn't supposed to say out loud.
yeah, because
They had,
I think they put them in brackets, and it's like, we'll do this. Pause. Take deep breath.
yeah. I mean, there's times where I've seen that when he's doing public appearances, like for photographs and stuff,
Yeah,
they have like small X's on the ground, like
yeah.
for the actors, they have X's on the ground so they know where to sit for the camera to record them and where they want to be on the scene.
Mm,
They needed to put that for Biden as well because he just couldn't, compute
I
himself
know.
where he needed to be at any given moment. And this was since like from going from walking from his air jet, personal jet or whatever to the airport or stuff like that. It's just yeah,
I
mental man,
mean,
mental.
it's the contrast. Putin's dealing with a war, as is Zelensky, while Biden looks like he can't even tackle.
Well, Zelensky, he's not that bad, but Zelensky is basically a mascot.
Hmm. I actually heard as well. This is a quick tangent. It's a video in itself, but I'm just going to inject it in here. I actually heard, that it's getting out now that Zelensky has SAS bodyguards.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Last I heard is that they were looking for a country for him to retire, quote unquote. I don't think he is even in Ukraine at the moment, and because whenever the war is about to end, he won't be returning
Hmm.
to Ukraine.
Oh yeah. One thing I do want to talk about though is something that Putin started to go into. I think these were warning shots to the West, NATO and the like, about what he knows and what he could reveal. So, for example, he from 37 minutes onwards, he starts giving information about the CIA and some of their operations. There's not too much of this. I certainly would have wanted that to be more. But also, Putin will be thinking, when this war is over, however it ends, how will I reintegrate into the world? Again, I'm not saying being best mates, but how will he reintegrate and go back to normalization? No matter how far fetched it seems, he will be thinking about that. How can he reintegrate into the global economy?
No matter what
So,
everyone says, everyone will be
mm,
thinking about that because as
yeah,
soon as the war ends, the global economy will shift again.
yep,
And
and they'll
depending
need
on where
Russian
the
gas.
money is, if there's more money in Russia being
Yeah,
included into the global economy, then that's what will
mm,
happen.
yep. So I think that's the other reason why he doesn't give too much details, or sorry, too many details about.
Because at the end of the day, sorry, I just want to say this,
No, it's
but
fine.
at the end of the day, it's not America that pulls the strings; it's the private companies that are
Oh
pulling
yeah,
the strings, basically. Some of
oh
them are in
yeah,
America, some of them aren't. But
mm,
at the end of the day, it's up to them,
oh yeah, definitely.
effectively.
Like I said,
Because if these
I
companies don't make profit, America won't make a profit, and it's just like a domino effect, kind of.
mm,
So yeah,
I am, and like I said, I think one of the reasons why he doesn't go into too much detail is not just to threaten them with what he knows and what he could reveal. It's also to not alienate them too much once this is over, to try and reintegrate. You know what I mean?
mm.
To not damage relations any further than he already has.
Oh yeah,
Because people, if he starts revealing stuff, people might not. Well, it sounds dumb, but when he'll be thinking when this dies down, people may not want to share information with him any further or have much interaction with him in case it gets out.
yeah,
So that's the way the Russian mindset works. They do think about exit strategies in the long term and the short term. Joe Biden showed us with Afghanistan he doesn't do either.
yeah.
Um, so some of the details he goes into here are, if these are true, these are quite interesting. So, for example, we hear a lot that they want to keep Russia as an enemy because they need some kind of global threat. When Bill Clinton was outgoing, it was the outgoing president. Putin claims to have had a conversation in relation to joining NATO in a hypothetical way, and he basically claimed. I mean, this conversation went on for a while. He basically claimed that Clinton would be open to the idea, but that the CIA and the intelligence agencies undercut Clinton and overruled him. And there was a lot of NATO criticism as well from Putin, and I think some of it is justified. The US exerts pressure, and NATO states obediently vote. I think there's some truth to that, given the fact that the Americans basically shoved their nukes everywhere recently into
Also,
into
it's
other
worth
countries.
saying that the way he articulated that, he didn't
Mm.
try to directly put the blame on CIA. He was just trying to state the fact. And I
Yeah,
don't even, I can't even remember if he mentioned CIA by name. It was more
mm.
about leaving it for us to imply that it was the CIA who undercut Clinton,
I
because
think
it's been
Carlson may have
quite
said
a.
it.
Oh, yeah, yeah, because it's been quite some time since I've seen the interview now.
Mm.
But yeah, that's the other thing. In the whole interview, he didn't try. Putin was mostly implying to give the hint that it was them without saying that it was them, and this was
Mm.
done in more than one case.
Um,
Which goes back to what you said earlier about thinking
oh yeah.
exit strategies.
I mean, the Russians as well. They have worked with the Americans in a limited capacity in past conflicts. Some of it was quite humorous, mind. For example, when the Americans invaded Iraq, what the Russians told them was, "Oh, by the way, this enemy you're fighting, we gave them a shitload of night vision goggles, so they have night fighting capability. We did it, Doc. We did it about a decade ago." So the Americans found out from the Russians that that the Iraqi army had the um the Republican Guard had NVG capability, but it wasn't just that. The Russians gave the Americans a lot of intel about Afghanistan when the Americans invaded Afghanistan in the 2000s. They gave them a lot of intel about that because
Mm.
the Russians themselves had a campaign in Afghanistan. So they have worked for them before. And like I said, there were two further cases of intelligence agencies undercutting the actual elected presidents. I just want to quickly say them. He does say before, though, he says, "I won't tell you the details because they were confidential." So again, either that's a threat, or he doesn't want to provoke the West any further, or he's thinking, he wants to reintegrate after this. So, for example, the US supporting terrorists in the Caucasus. He claims that the CIA worked with the opposition in Russia and said it was the right thing to do. Claims the Joint Missile Defense System under Bush was a threat to Russia's security if developed, unless it was developed in a way that incorporated them. And apparently, the Americans were open to having Russia on board with that, but the CIA undercut it and effectively said that the Russians couldn't be involved, keeping them as an enemy. So why I say this, I think Putin could read the room very well, and he knows what Tucker Carlson's audience is, because because it was Tucker Carlson that articulated that to Putin. So the intelligence agencies are undermining the elected ruler or the elected leader, and that is actually one of Tucker Carlson's big philosophies in his actual narrative, in his product, in his journalism. He is someone who was always talking about that in America, the FBI, the CIA, basically running the government instead of the government itself. So he was always going to latch on to those kinds of stories from Putin and allow Putin to go into more detail about them or limited detail about them, talk longer about them, because that fits into Putin's product. It fits into his narrative. It fits into what his audience wants to hear. So I think that was a bit of that was quite the tactical decision from Putin to basically, whether these stories are true or not, we don't know, to at least give those stories out, because Tucker Carlson was always going to bite the bait for them and ask for more.
Mm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Putin did claim that the presidents did seem open to including Russia into NATO, hypothetically, and the missile defense system as well. And those are the two examples. I should have stated that far more clearly. Those were the two examples that Putin claimed were when the intelligence agencies undercut the president altogether. The first one, I'm guessing, is that the US president, Bill Clinton, couldn't hypothetically say, "Sure, we'd allow Russia and NATO," because the CIA, according to Putin, or the intelligence agencies, according to Putin, told him no. And the missile defense system as well, same thing. They wanted to be in it, they wanted to develop it, because apparently the threat was Iran, and they wouldn't let them in. He claimed that was the CIA after the president was initially open to them joining. But I don't know if there's any truth to that, but he did let Carlson bring in names like the FBI and the CIA, or the CIA rather, And I think he engineered what he was saying to allow Carlson to draw that conclusion. So he could simply just confirm it, if that makes sense. Carlson's the one that says it out loud.
Yeah.
So I think there was a bit of manipulation there on Putin's part.
Oh yeah, totally. Like we said, at the end of the day, he's a politician, but manipulation was to be expected. And there's always some sort of manipulation when you are interviewing people for political matters. When I say interviewing people, I mean like politicians for political matters. There's always some sort of either manipulation or underlying propaganda or underlying agenda. Because even if you, as the interviewer, are impartial and objective, the interviewee isn't.